August 30th, 1981. Monroe Street, Manhattan. Benjamin Ruggiero stepped out of his apartment building and turned toward the morning sun. His hands were empty. He had left his jewelry on the dresser, his wallet by the fish tanks. Everything of value tucked away where his wife would find it. He knew what was waiting. At 55 years old, after 30 years in the life, Lefty Ruggiero understood the mathematics of betrayal. He was walking to his own execution. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the FBI was already there, engines running, ready to save the man who had destroyed him. The story begins not with guns or blood, but with something far more dangerous: trust. In September 1976, a stranger appeared in the bars and social clubs of Little Italy, a man calling himself Donnie Brasco. He moved like someone who understood the streets, spoke like someone raised in the neighborhoods, and most importantly, he knew when to be quiet. In the underworld of the five families, silence was currency. Donnie Brasco seemed to understand this instinctively. He was looking for work, fencing stolen jewelry, moving merchandise, the small-time operations that kept wise guys fed between bigger scores. And in those smoke-filled rooms where men measured each other by glances and gestures, Brasco caught the attention of Benjamin Ruggiero. Lefty Ruggiero was not a boss. He was not a captain with crews answering to him or soldiers carrying out his orders. He was a made man in the Bonanno crime family, certainly. Inducted in the late 1970s after repaying a debt of $160,000 to fellow soldier Nicholas Marangello. But Lefty operated at street level, grinding out his survival through bookmaking, loan sharking, and enforcement. He was known for two things: his skill with dice, thrown left-handed, and his reputation for violence. Lefty claimed to have murdered 26 men, a number he repeated often enough that it became part of his mythology in the neighborhood. The FBI could never verify that count, and whether it was truth or boast remained uncertain. What was certain was Lefty's willingness to kill when ordered, his understanding of mob protocol around murder, and his habit of carrying backup weapons on hits. On the street, they called him Lefty, or sometimes Lefty Guns. The Two Guns moniker that later appeared in newspapers and film was largely media embellishment, mob flair added by reporters who loved the dramatic ring of it. But in 1976, as autumn settled over New York and Donnie Brasco began appearing at the social clubs, Lefty Ruggiero was a man in decline. He was deep in gambling debt again, always chasing the next score, always owing someone. His son Tommy was destroying himself with heroin. His standing in the family was precarious. Younger captains were rising while Lefty remained stuck at soldier, watching men half his age given opportunities he'd never see. In this environment of frustration and fear, when a street-smart jewel thief from Florida showed up looking for connections, Lefty saw possibility. The introduction came through Anthony Mira, a Bonanno soldier who'd met Brasco in his operations. Mira brought Brasco around, vouched for him in the beginning. But it was Lefty who took him in, who began the process of education that would become a 6-year infiltration. That first meeting was unremarkable, a conversation in a bar, Lefty testing this new face with questions about jewelry, about criminal experience, about who Brasco knew and where he'd worked. Brasco had answers. He knew gemstones. He understood the fencing business. He spoke the language of the street. What Lefty didn't know, what no one in that bar knew, was that Donnie Brasco had spent time at a gemology school, learning to identify diamonds and precious stones, a crash course designed to bolster the jeweler persona. He had been given a complete criminal background by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a legend built from scratch with documentation and planted references. Joseph Pistone, the FBI agent beneath the jewelry thief's disguise, had volunteered for an operation initially expected to last 6 months. The goal was modest: infiltrate the truck hijacking rings that plagued New York City, gather evidence, make arrests. But the FBI had never successfully placed an agent inside one of the 5 families. They were about to discover what that kind of access would cost. Lefty began bringing Brasco to his bookmaking operation, letting him place bets, take collections, learn the rhythm of the business. In those early weeks, Lefty was teaching constantly. He explained how to sit in a restaurant so you could see the door, how to speak carefully around strangers, how to read the power dynamics in a room full of made men, when to stay quiet, when to ask questions. Brasco absorbed everything, playing the role of eager student, and Lefty warmed to him. Here was someone who listened, who showed respect, who didn't challenge Lefty's authority the way younger punks did. Here was someone who might actually be loyal. By early 1977, the relationship had deepened beyond mentor and student. Lefty was bringing Brasco around the family, introducing him to other soldiers, to captains, letting the FBI agent see the machinery of organized crime from the inside. Brasco worked Lefty's social club, hung around the same spots, began to know the patterns and faces. The FBI, monitoring from a distance, realized they had achieved something unprecedented: genuine access to Bonanno family operations. But maintaining that access required Joseph Pistone to live almost entirely as Donnie Brasco. He moved into an apartment in Little Italy. He kept another place in Florida for when operations required it. His wife and 3 daughters lived elsewhere, seeing him rarely. The separation was devastating. Weeks and months would pass without contact. Pistone unable to maintain his marriage or fatherhood, while playing the role that was consuming him. The Bonanno family that Brasco infiltrated was already fractured. This was a family in the aftermath of chaos. In the early 1960s, founding boss Joseph Bonanno had attempted to eliminate rival bosses and consolidate power. The plan failed spectacularly, leading to what became known as the Bonanno War, a conflict that left the Bonannos weakened and Joseph Bonanno himself forced into exile by the Commission in 1968. The family never fully recovered. By the mid-70s, official boss Philip Rastelli was in prison, and acting boss Carmine Galante was running operations with increasing recklessness. Galante was dangerous. A veteran mafioso who'd killed dozens, he'd been paroled in 1974 after serving time for narcotics trafficking, and immediately began consolidating control. He brought in Sicilian drug dealers, known as Zips, for the speed at which they spoke their native language, to serve as muscle and importers. He challenged the Gambino family for control of New York's heroin trade, allegedly ordering 8 Gambino members murdered. And perhaps most dangerously, Galante began referring to himself as boss of bosses, declaring his supremacy over the commission itself. For Lefty and Brasco, Galante's ascension meant opportunity. In the world of organized crime, chaos creates openings. Brasco was proving himself as an earner, bringing FBI money into mob operations, providing criminal opportunities that looked legitimate, establishing himself as valuable. And in 1977, as Lefty paid off enough of his debt to finally become a made man, Brasco was there as best man at his wedding. The FBI agent stood beside the mobster as he married, watched Lefty's pride and joy, saw the man's desperation for respect and stability. It should have been a warning. This was getting personal. But the operation was producing intelligence beyond anything the FBI had imagined. Brasco was recording conversations, documenting structures, learning the inner workings of not just the Bonannos, but all 5 families through their interconnections. July 12th, 1979. Knickerbocker Avenue, Brooklyn. Carmine Galante sat down to lunch at Joe and Mary's Italian-American restaurant, owned by his cousin Giuseppe Turano. It was a hot afternoon and they ate on the patio in the garden. With Galante were Turano, a Bonanno soldier, and Leonard Coppola, a longtime captain loyal to Galante. Standing guard were Galante's bodyguards, Sicilian zips named Cesare Bonventre and Baldassare Amato. At 2:45 p.m., as Galante lit his ever-present cigar, 3 masked gunmen appeared. They opened fire with shotguns and handguns at point-blank range. Galante, Turano, and Coppola died instantly. The bodyguards walked away unharmed. A photograph of Galante's body, the cigar still clenched in his teeth, would appear on newspaper front pages worldwide. The murder had been sanctioned by the commission. Even the retired Joseph Bonanno had approved. The hit team, according to FBI informants, included Dominic Sonny Black Napolitani and Anthony Bruno Indelicato, son of Bonanno Captain Alphonse Sonny Red Indelicato. The betrayal by Galante's own bodyguards was deliberate. They'd been promised promotions and larger cuts of the drug business. This was the mob's message. No one was untouchable. The commission's word was absolute. But Galante's death didn't stabilize the Bonanno family. Instead, it split into warring factions. Sonny Black, who had participated in the Galante hit, now aligned with boss Rastelli and Captain Joseph Massino. Against them stood Sonny Red Indelicato, Dominic Big Trin Trinchera, and Philip Lucky Giaccone. Both sides began positioning for dominance, and caught in the middle were soldiers like Lefty Ruggiero and associates like Donnie Brasco. After Galante's murder, Sonny Black took Brasco under his wing more directly, seeing the earning potential Lefty had been cultivating. This created tension. Lefty felt bypassed, sidelined again by younger, more ambitious men. But he had vouched for Brasco, had brought him into the family, and that meant Lefty's life was tied to Brasco's legitimacy. If Brasco turned out to be anything other than what he claimed, a federal agent, a rat, an imposter, Lefty would pay with his life. This was the code. You vouched with your life. Every time Lefty introduced Brasco to another made man, every time he confirmed Brasco's story to suspicious captains, Lefty was placing his own head on the chopping block. The FBI watched all of this unfold. Pistone was no longer a simple infiltrator gathering basic intelligence. He was positioned at the center of family politics during one of its most violent periods. He was being brought to meetings, witnessing conversations about murders, learning the decision-making processes. The Bureau began using him for complex operations, staging fake crimes to maintain his cover, recording wire intercepts, identifying criminal networks. But there was a cost. Pistone's marriage was disintegrating. His wife rarely saw him. His daughters were growing up without a father. And Joseph Pistone himself was changing. He was learning to think like Lefty, to see the world through the eyes of a career criminal. When he moved through Little Italy with Lefty, he began noticing the same things, reacting to the same cues, understanding the unspoken rules without conscious thought. By 1980, Lefty had grown dependent on Brasco. He confided in him about his frustrations with the family, about his son's addiction, about his mounting debts. Brasco became something more than an associate. He became the person Lefty trusted most. And Pistone, despite knowing he was playing a role, despite knowing how this would end, found himself caring about Lefty's fate. This was the danger of deep cover work that the FBI hadn't fully anticipated. Relationships form, bonds develop. The line between role and reality blurs in ways that training doesn't prepare you for. The violence was escalating. The two Bonanno factions were preparing for war. Massino and Sonny Black, backed by Rastelli from prison, knew the rival captains were stockpiling weapons and planning to strike first. They went to the Commission for approval to act preemptively. In early 1981, the Commission granted permission. On May 5, 1981, Sonny Red, Big Trin, and Lucky Giaccone were summoned to a meeting at a Brooklyn social club. They arrived unarmed, following the mob tradition that made men don't carry weapons to sit-downs with other made men. It was a trap. They were ambushed with machine gun fire. All three were killed. According to testimony, Sonny Black, Messino, and their crew carried out the murders. Lefty, though part of the broader conspiracy and aligned with the winning faction, was marginalized during the actual violence, kept at a distance from the bloody work by captains who increasingly saw him as unreliable. His role was peripheral. His exclusion from the core action, another reminder of his declining status within the family structure. After the three captains' murders, the FBI's concern intensified. Pistone was now in deeper than any agent had ever been. Sonny Black was rising in power, and he wanted Brasco officially inducted. He was pushing for Brasco to become a made man. The FBI faced an impossible decision. If they pulled Pistone out now, they would expose him, and everyone who had vouched for him would be killed. But if they allowed the induction to proceed, they would have an FBI agent taking a blood oath to a criminal organization. More critically, the final requirement for induction often involved committing a murder to prove loyalty. The order came in the summer of 1981. Brasco was to kill Anthony Bruno Indelicato, son of the murdered Sonny Red. Bruno had gone into hiding after his father's death, but Sonny Black wanted him dead. The assignment was given to Brasco. Pistone reported this to the FBI. They discussed staging the murder, making it appear Brasco had carried out the hit while Bruno went into protective custody. But the Bureau had reached its limit. The operation was too dangerous. The exposure risk was too high. On July 26, 1981, after 6 years of infiltration, Operation Sunapple, the official FBI case name, a play on Florida's sunshine and New York's Big Apple, was terminated. Pistone left Florida for the last time on July 24th, spending his final days with Sonny Black and Lefty. He flew to Milwaukee to testify in an unrelated case against Milwaukee boss Frank Balistrieri. On July 26th, FBI agents visited Sonny Black at his apartment above the Motion Lounge in Brooklyn. They showed him photographs of Pistone in his FBI credentials, standing with other agents. Sonny Black was in denial at first. Then the realization set in. He'd vouched for a federal agent. He'd brought an FBI infiltrator to family meetings, let him witness murders, discussed criminal operations in front of him. Sonny Black knew what was coming. The Bonanno leadership reacted with fury. A contract was immediately placed on Pistone's life, reportedly $500,000 for whoever killed him, though this figure, like much mob lore, was never verified since no one ever collected. But the first targets were the men who had vouched for Brasco. Sonny Black disappeared on August 17, 1981, called to a meeting with family leadership. His body was found nearly a year later in a creek in Staten Island. His hands had been severed, a symbolic message. These were the hands that had embraced a traitor. Lefty received a similar summons. On August 30th, 1981, he was called to meet at Nicholas Marangello's social club. Lefty understood what this meant. He'd seen men called to meetings and never returned. He'd participated in such meetings himself. And so he left his jewelry, his valuables, everything laid out for his wife to find. He walked out of his apartment expecting to die. The FBI intercepted him on the street. Agents had been monitoring the Bonanno communications and learned about the contract. They picked up Lefty before he could reach the meeting, taking him into protective custody. It saved his life, but Lefty refused to cooperate. When offered witness protection in exchange for testimony, he cited omertà, the code of silence. He would not become a rat. Even after learning that Donnie Brasco had been an FBI agent for 6 years, even after understanding he'd been completely deceived, Lefty would not cooperate. His reaction to the betrayal was complex. Initially, he refused to believe it. He told his lawyer that Brasco would never testify against him, that the kid was solid. But when Pistone did testify, when the evidence became undeniable, Lefty's denial turned to rage. He was recorded saying he would get that motherfucker Donnie if it was the last thing he did. But he never cooperated with law enforcement, never provided information, never broke omertà. In November 1982, Lefty Ruggiero was convicted of racketeering conspiracy. The charges included conspiracy in the murders of the 3 captains, drug distribution, extortion, illegal gambling, and planning a bank robbery. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The evidence against him had come primarily from Joseph Pistone's testimony and the recordings made during the infiltration. Donnie Brasco had testified against the man who'd mentored him, taught him, trusted him completely. The impact of Operation Donnie Brasco extended far beyond Lefty Ruggiero. The evidence collected by Pistone led to over 200 indictments and more than 100 convictions. The Bonanno family was devastated. So many members were arrested, so much leadership was imprisoned or killed, that the commission suspended the Bonannos from their seat at the table. For years, the family existed in limbo, disgraced and weakened. The infiltration changed how the 5 families operated. New rules were instituted. Before a man could be inducted, he had to commit murder, ensuring blood evidence of commitment. And 2 family members, instead of 1, had to vouch for prospects, spreading the risk of betrayal. More broadly, Operation Donnie Brasco transformed FBI tactics. Before Pistone, the Bureau had relied almost exclusively on informants, criminals who'd been caught and flipped, offering information to reduce their sentences. These informants were limited in what they could access and what they knew. But a deep cover agent properly prepared and committed could penetrate to the core of criminal organizations. The success of the operation led the FBI to develop more sophisticated undercover programs, train agents in longer-term infiltrations, and accept the psychological costs of maintaining false identities for years. For Pistone himself, the aftermath was permanent exile. The contract on his life remained open. The FBI relocated him and his family to an undisclosed location under assumed names. His wife divorced him. The strain of 6 years undercover, the impossibility of normal family life, the psychological weight of his double existence, it had all been too much. Pistone remained with the FBI, eventually requesting reinstatement in 1992 after a brief retirement. At 53, he completed the full 16-week training course at Quantico alongside recruits in their 20s, then served until mandatory retirement at 57. He wrote books about the operation, worked as a consultant on films and investigations, but he could never fully return to normal life. Every photograph, every public appearance, every interview was conducted with awareness that someone somewhere might still be looking to collect that contract. In prison, Lefty Ruggiero became a ghost. The respect he'd craved his entire life evaporated. He was the man who'd been fooled for 6 years, who'd vouched for a Fed, who'd brought destruction to the family. Other prisoners knew who he was and what he represented. Some avoided him, others mocked him. Lefty served his time in isolation, neither cooperating with authorities nor regaining status with the family. He maintained his silence, honored omertà. But there was no reward for that loyalty. The family didn't celebrate his refusal to become a rat. They simply forgot about him. His health began deteriorating in the early 90s. Lung cancer and testicular cancer ravaged his body. In April 1993, after serving nearly 11 years, Lefty was released on compassionate grounds. He returned to New York, to the neighborhoods he'd known, but he was a relic of a different era. The mob had changed. The old codes were dying. Younger mobsters were more willing to cooperate with prosecutors, trading information for reduced sentences. The honor Lefty had lived by was becoming obsolete. On November 24, 1994, Benjamin Ruggiero died in his New York home. He was 68 years old. There was no mob funeral, no gathering of made men to honor a fallen soldier. Lefty had become an embarrassment, a cautionary tale about the dangers of trust. His death was barely noted. In the weeks that followed, a few newspaper articles mentioned his passing, usually in the context of the Donnie Brasco operation. But there were no eulogies from the family he'd served for 30 years, no recognition of his refusal to cooperate, even when cooperation could have saved him. The story of Lefty Ruggiero and Donnie Brasco is often told as a triumph of law enforcement, and it was. The FBI achieved unprecedented infiltration of the Mafia, gathered evidence that decimated organized crime families, and demonstrated the effectiveness of long-term undercover operations. But it's also a tragedy about belief, about what happens when the things you've organized your life around turn out to be lies. Lefty believed in the mob. He believed in hierarchy, respect, loyalty, codes of conduct that gave meaning to violence. He believed that if you followed the rules, honored omertà, served your family, you would be protected and valued. Every lesson he taught Donnie Brasco was rooted in these beliefs. And then Donnie Brasco turned out to be Joseph Pistone, an FBI agent who'd been gathering evidence to destroy everything Lefty believed in. The person Lefty had trusted most, the person he'd confided in about his son's addiction and his frustrations with the family, the person he'd vouched for repeatedly at risk of his own life, that person was law enforcement. The intimacy of the betrayal is what made it devastating. This wasn't an informant in the family leaking information. This was someone Lefty had personally mentored, someone he'd brought into his daily life, someone who'd been at his wedding. Pistone himself acknowledged the complexity of this. In interviews after the operation, he spoke about the difficulty of maintaining his cover while developing real relationships. He described Lefty as someone who genuinely cared about Brasco, who tried to protect him, who saw him almost as a son. And Pistone, despite knowing he was playing a role, couldn't help but see Lefty's humanity, his desperation for respect, his struggles with his addicted son, his pride when Brasco succeeded. This made the eventual testimony harder. Pistone was doing his job, providing evidence against criminals, but he was also destroying a man who'd trusted him completely. The deeper question raised by Lefty's story is about the nature of loyalty itself. Lefty never cooperated. He refused witness protection. He served his time. He died outside the family's graces, but with his code intact. From one perspective, this makes him honorable. A man who stuck to his principles even when those principles cost him everything. From another perspective, it makes him a victim of false consciousness, someone so committed to a corrupt system that he couldn't see how that system had failed him long before Donnie Brasco appeared. The Bonanno family had never truly valued Lefty. He was a soldier, useful muscle, someone to collect debts and place bets and occasionally kill people when ordered. But he was never going to rise higher. His gambling addiction kept him in debt. His volatile temper made him unreliable for leadership. The family used him for 30 years and gave him nothing in return. And when he was exposed as the man who'd vouch for a Fed, they discarded him instantly. There was no trial within the family, no investigation into whether Lefty himself had been complicit, just instant condemnation. If the FBI hadn't intercepted him on August 30th, 1981, Lefty would have been murdered by the same men he'd served his entire adult life. This is the paradox at the center of Lefty's story. He was destroyed by his loyalty to an organization that felt no loyalty to him. The code he lived by, omertà, respect for hierarchy, honor among criminals, was revealed to be one-sided. Lefty honored the code. The family honored only power. When he became a liability, when his association with Donnie Brasco made him an embarrassment, the family moved to eliminate him without hesitation. The very loyalty Lefty prided himself on was weaponized against him. It kept him silent, prevented him from saving himself through cooperation, and ultimately left him dying alone with nothing to show for 3 decades of service. Yet Lefty never acknowledged this. Even after his conviction, even after serving time, even as cancer ate away at his body, he maintained his identity as a loyal soldier. In his mind, he hadn't been betrayed by the family. He'd been betrayed by Donnie Brasco. The FBI had tricked him, deceived him through superior tradecraft and patience. But the family itself, the structure he'd served, that remained sacred. This cognitive dissonance is what makes his story particularly tragic. Lefty couldn't see that the real betrayal wasn't Pistone's deception. It was the mob's willingness to sacrifice him the moment he stopped being useful. The 1997 film Donnie Brasco, starring Al Pacino as Lefty and Johnny Depp as Pistone, captured some of this tragedy. The film's final scenes show Lefty preparing to meet his fate, leaving his valuables for his wife, accepting that he's about to be killed for vouching for a Fed. The movie takes liberty with some facts. It implies Lefty was killed when in reality he was arrested and later released. But it understands the emotional core of the story. This is a man destroyed by trust, someone whose commitment to a code left him vulnerable to exploitation by both law enforcement and the criminals he served. What the film doesn't fully explore is the systemic nature of Lefty's tragedy. He wasn't an outlier. The Bonanno family, like all 5 families, was built on a foundation of exploitation, disguised as honor. Soldiers like Lefty performed the family's dirty work, the murders, the enforcement, the daily grind of criminal enterprise, while captains and bosses reaped the profits and avoided prosecution. The code of omertà protected leadership more than soldiers. When someone got caught, when someone became a liability, it was the low-level members who paid the price. Lefty's story is the story of countless mobsters who believed in something that never believed in them. The FBI's use of Pistone raises its own ethical questions. Developing real relationships for years, becoming embedded in someone's daily life, allowing that person to trust you completely, all for the purpose of eventual betrayal and prosecution. This is morally complex work. The FBI would argue it's necessary. Organized crime causes real harm. The Bonanno family was involved in drug trafficking, murder, extortion, robbery. Stopping that activity justifies undercover operations. But there's something unsettling about the intimacy of the deception. Pistone attended Lefty's wedding. He was there for personal moments, family moments, times when Lefty wasn't performing his mobster role, but was simply being a father, a husband, a man struggling with his life. Pistone himself seems to have wrestled with this. In his books and interviews, he's careful to maintain that Lefty was a criminal who deserved prosecution. But he also acknowledges the human cost. Lefty cared about him. Lefty tried to protect him. And Pistone, while gathering evidence, had to respond to that care in ways that felt genuine. This wasn't a simple case of an agent maintaining a cover. It was years of daily interaction, shared experiences, mutual vulnerability. The boundaries between role and reality became permeable. The long-term impact of Operation Donnie Brasco on American organized crime is difficult to overstate. Before Pistone, the five families operated with relative impunity. They controlled rackets across New York, influenced unions and businesses, bribed officials, and committed violence without meaningful fear of prosecution. The mob seemed untouchable, protected by omertà and their insular structure. But Pistone demonstrated that patience, preparation, and willingness to commit years to an operation could penetrate even the mafia. The psychological impact was devastating. If the Bonannos could be infiltrated so thoroughly, any family could be. Trust became impossible. Every new associate, every introduction, every business partner became a potential threat. This paranoia accelerated the mafia's decline in the 80s and 90s. Combined with RICO prosecutions, witness protection programs that encouraged cooperation, and aggressive law enforcement tactics, the five families lost power dramatically. Many longtime mobsters, seeing the writing on the wall, began cooperating with prosecutors. The code of omertà weakened as self-preservation overcame loyalty. By the time Lefty died in 1994, the mafia he'd known was largely gone. The new generation was more concerned with avoiding prison than upholding traditions. The old bosses were dead or imprisoned. The structure was fragmenting. Lefty's commitment to the old ways made him increasingly anachronistic. The story also changed public perception of the mafia. For decades, organized crime had been romanticized in popular culture. The Godfather films, books about mob history, the mythology of honor among thieves. But Operation Donnie Brasco revealed the mundane reality. Most mobsters weren't sophisticated criminal masterminds. They were men like Lefty, grinding out survival through small-time rackets, constantly in debt, paranoid and violent. The infiltration showed the mob's operational dysfunction, the internal conflicts, the exploitation of lower members, the arbitrary violence. This demystification was as damaging as the prosecutions. The mafia lost its mystique along with its power. For the Bonanno family specifically, the damage was catastrophic. The commission suspended them, a humiliation that lasted years. Members were imprisoned in waves. Leadership was decimated. The family struggled to rebuild, eventually regaining some standing under Joseph Massino in the 90s, but they never recovered their previous influence. The Donnie Brasco operation became a scar on family history, a constant reminder of vulnerability. Every time someone was proposed for membership, every time an associate was brought around, the question arose, could this be another Donnie Brasco? Lefty Ruggiero's final years remain largely undocumented. After his release in 1993, he returned to obscurity. There are no detailed accounts of how he spent his last months, no interviews, no public appearances. He was sick, dying of cancer, living in the same neighborhoods he'd once operated in, but now as an outsider. The mob had moved on. The old crews were gone. The streets he'd known were changing. Little Italy was gentrifying, becoming more tourist destination than neighborhood. The social clubs were closing. The infrastructure of the old mob was disappearing. He died at home, surrounded not by the family he'd served, but by his actual family. His wife, possibly his children if they maintained contact. The man who'd spent 30 years in organized crime, who'd boasted of 26 murders, whether true or exaggerated, who'd been at the center of one of the most successful FBI operations in history, died quietly in bed. No headline-making death, no mob funeral, no final dramatic gesture. Just an old man dying of cancer, largely forgotten by everyone except those who'd studied the Donnie Brasco case. The question that haunts Lefty's story is whether he ever understood what had happened to him. Did he in those final months reflect on the arc of his life and see the pattern? Did he recognize that the family had always been using him? That loyalty was never going to protect him? That the code was a mechanism of control rather than mutual support? Or did he maintain until the end his belief in what he'd served, seeing his fate as the result of one betrayal rather than systemic exploitation? The evidence suggests Lefty never broke faith. He maintained his silence, honored omertà even when it cost him everything. This wasn't stupidity or stubbornness, it was identity. Lefty had organized his entire self around being a mobster. His sense of worth, his understanding of how the world worked, his relationships and daily routines, all of it was built on the foundation of being a made man in the Bonanno family. To acknowledge that the family had betrayed him, that the code was false, that his loyalty had been misplaced, this would have required dismantling his entire identity. And most people faced with that choice prefer to maintain their existing beliefs rather than confront such fundamental wrongness. This is why Lefty's story resonates beyond the specifics of mob history. It's a story about what happens when your organizing principles turn out to be lies, when the things you've based your life on prove hollow. Lefty chose to keep believing because the alternative was too devastating. He died within his illusions, which might be seen as either tragic or merciful depending on your perspective. Tragic because he never achieved understanding. Merciful because he was spared the nihilistic despair of recognizing how thoroughly he'd been used. Joseph Pistone lives on, still under assumed names, still with the reported contract on his life even decades later. The FBI says the threat is minimal now. Most of the people who knew Brasco are dead or imprisoned, and the younger generation of mobsters doesn't carry the same grudges. But precautions remain. Pistone moves carefully, chooses his appearances strategically, maintains operational security that has become second nature. He has written extensively about the operation, worked as a consultant, given testimony in numerous trials. The Donnie Brasco identity has become his most significant accomplishment and his permanent burden. In interviews, Pistone speaks about Lefty with something like regret. Not regret for the operation, he maintains it was necessary and successful, but regret for the human cost. He understands that Lefty was a criminal who committed serious crimes, but he also understands that Lefty was a person, someone with motivations and fears and vulnerabilities, someone whose trust was genuine even if misplaced. The operation required Pistone to exploit that trust systematically, to use Lefty's need for validation and respect as tools of infiltration. This produced results, but also complicated the moral calculus. The philosophical question raised by the Donnie Brasco operation is whether the ends justified the means. The FBI achieved unprecedented penetration of the mafia, gathered evidence that led to hundreds of convictions, disrupted criminal operations worth millions of dollars. American organized crime never fully recovered from the blow. From a utilitarian perspective focused on outcomes, this justifies the operation. But the method involved years of intimate deception, the cultivation of relationships for the explicit purpose of betrayal, and the exploitation of human needs for connection and trust. From a deontological perspective concerned with the nature of actions themselves, this raises serious questions. Lefty Ruggiero spent his life serving a lie. The Bonanno family promised respect, protection, and belonging in exchange for loyalty and violence. It delivered none of those things. Lefty remained a low-level soldier his entire career, perpetually in debt, constantly insecure, ultimately discarded the moment he became inconvenient. The code of omertà that he honored so completely was never honored in return. The loyalty he showed was never reciprocated. He was used, exhausted and abandoned. But perhaps more poignantly, the one relationship in his later life that felt genuine, his friendship with Donnie Brasco, was the most complete deception of all.